Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the MARTA South DeKalb Transit Initiative Study Public Meeting. We are really excited today to have you all here, and we really appreciate each and everyone's time. All right. Next slide, please. Just some meeting ground housekeeping rules this evening. Our event is going to be from 6 to 7 tonight. Please use the Q&A section to submit your project-specific questions or comments. If we have some time, we will make sure that we get to everyone's questions after 7 o'clock. That's why you see the 6 to 8 here, just in case. Your input is welcomed. Please use the online comment card that will be provided at the end of the meeting. We really appreciate your feedback as we move forward in this project. If you miss any details for tonight, you will please feel free to visit southdekabtransit.com. We'll have the presentation up in the next 2 days where you'll be able to view it online. And most importantly, we have some upcoming in-person meetings that we would like you to share with your community. The next one will be tomorrow evening from 6:30 to 7:30 at Browns Mill Recreational Center. And that is located in Stonecrest, as you'll see it here on the screen. The next meeting after that, we'll have 2 open houses. One will be from 11 a.m. to 1 p.m., the other from 5 p.m. to 7 p.m., and that will be at New Life Church in Decatur. So we are looking forward to seeing you all there. Again, please share the details with your community as we would like as much feedback as possible. Once again, the comment cards that we will submit to you guys towards the end of the meeting. And I would like to turn the meeting over to Brian Hobbs. He is MARTA project manager for this project. Brian.
All right, thank you, Katrina. And welcome everyone, as Katrina mentioned. Really appreciate you guys showing up for this meeting today. And so what I'm going to do is kind of give an overview of the purpose of today's meeting. So as Katrina mentioned, I am the project manager. So if you have any questions, you would be able to reach out to me. You'll see my contact information at the end of the presentation. But today's meeting is about a few things. So as you can see here, number one, introducing the alternative screening process. Now, some of you may know what the alternative screening process is, and some of you may not. You may have seen this on other projects. It's just a process that we at MARTA actually have to go through when it comes to determining what mode of transportation and what routes that we are going to be implementing as part of our plan. And so that's what you're going to see today, what we did for this project. It's going to be very important that you understand this process, because this process is not different for any project. It's the same process with regards to how we go about identifying the different routes and the different modes, and how we go about deciding on which modes move forward and which routes move forward. So you'll hear about that today. We'll talk about the introduction of the transit alternatives that can be delivered with existing funding. As you know, this is anytime we're looking to implement any type of project, a transit project, we have to have some existing funding or some source of funding that allows us to do that. And so that's what we'll talk about as well. We're going to introduce some of these alternatives that we see can be funded right now, and we'll talk about that. And then the third step is we'll collect feedback on the process and alternatives considered. So your feedback is important. This process doesn't end with us looking at things and then bringing it to you. This process continues with your feedback. So your feedback is going to actually go into how we continue to move this project forward. And so that is something that is very important. So there will be surveys, and we will need you to get as many people as you can to respond and to provide feedback and comments to us about what you see here today, as well as what you see in the future going forward. Next slide. So what I'll do now is go into a little bit of the project introduction. This slide here you may have seen in a number of presentations. So when you look at this slide, what I really want to focus in on right now is 2019, because everything before 2019 at this point really does not inform how we move forward. What informs how we move forward right now is the screening process that we're doing currently, as well as what you see here in blue. In 2019, the DeKalb Transit Master Plan was developed. So the county, MARTA, and other jurisdictional partners came together and really pulled together a plan, which is the DeKalb Transit Master Plan, which laid out a roadmap of the different alternatives that can be considered with different funding scenarios. And so that is something I want you to pay attention to as I talk and we go through this presentation, because that plan sets the stage. That plan sets the stage for how we move forward at MARTA with regards to what's going on in the county. If you also look here, you see some other plans in blue. The things in blue are areas or plans in which MARTA did not have any control. So I want you to pay attention to that as well. But as I mentioned, the DeKalb Transit Master Plan sets the stage from 2019. Next slide, please. And so I kind of talked a little bit about today's purpose of today's meeting. If you look at that study area, this is you may have seen before. If you look at the dotted line or the dashed line, the red dashed line, this is the entire study area that we've looked at over the past few months. We've looked within this area to find different routes for transit opportunity, which will serve the population at a greater efficiency. You'll also see here, we look for connectivity. So if you see in this map, you have Canlet Road, ART, which is called out, it is green on this map. You also have the two transit centers that we are building in South DeKalb as well. And so when we're looking at this area and looking at identifying alternatives and modes and routes, we are taking these into consideration as we continue to move this process forward. Next slide, please. And so if you think about what I mentioned earlier about the 2019 DeKalb Transit Master Plan, where we're starting now, what is the building block here that we're building from? There's a few things that took place with that in the scenario. So if you look at the financial scenarios evaluated, what could be afforded with a potential new DeKalb County sales tax. Now, it's important to understand that the current sales tax goes towards the current system, and that is operating and maintaining. So that is where the current sales tax goes to. And so when you start looking at the existing MARTA penny scenario, we really cannot build any new very large expansion projects with the existing penny because it is already being utilized. So that means we need to add an additional sales tax of some sort to basically build out new transit lines, new very large transit lines. And so if you look here, this is what came out of the DeKalb Transit Master Plan. The additional half penny sales tax scenario, it did include bus rapid transit along I-285 and I-20. There was also an additional full penny scenario, which also had the bus rapid transit, but it also added arterial rapid transit on Covington Highway. But then there's also the greater than 4 penny scenario. So one thing we have to think about with the greater than 4 penny scenario is that where we lie with the tax and how much tax can actually be put onto the county because you do max out at a certain point. But in the DeKalb Transit Master Plans, you can see the heavy rail transit, which is the current LPA for this project, the current locally preferred alternative, heavy rail transit along I-285 and I-20 with an additional BRT. That fell in the greater than 4 penny scenario. So as you can see, this sets the stage for how we looked at things and how we move forward. But we'll talk a little bit more about how we laid this entire process out and what we discussed. Next slide. So this is a timeline. You may have seen this before, and it's our first meetings of the year. As you can see, we started winter spring 2022 in this process, and we started with existing conditions and confirming the purpose and need. We then quickly moved into the summer to reevaluate the previously locally preferred alternative, which again, it is heavy rail and BRT, both are considered the locally preferred alternative right now. And then we had to understand the cost and performance impacts of that. And so that's where we did that. We kind of looked at the different costs. Costs have risen pretty significantly because of materials and just other elements that have taken place after the pandemic. So things are much more expensive. So we took a look at that and evaluated that. And then what we did, we found 10 alternatives. We identified 10 alternatives that potentially could move forward, that met all of the criteria that can move forward for a project that is viable and can receive federal funding. We compared heavy rail BRT alternatives against other alternatives, which is the current LPA. And then we did a revised purpose and need statement because, again, things have changed since the last LPA. So this is something we had to do as well. We have to revise the purpose and need to make sure it's actually meeting what we're looking to do going forward. And so now we're here, we're updating the locally preferred alternative. That's where we're rolling to that December 2023 opportunity to update the LPA. And so today you'll see those 10 alternatives that we've identified. We'll talk about why we looked at those and what the differences are of those 10 alternatives. And then we'll talk about the next steps and what it looks like moving forward with this project during tonight's presentation. And I do want to point out, you will, as you can see, ongoing public and stakeholder engagement. We will continue to engage the public and stakeholders as we go through this process. So you'll stay involved and informed. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about project goals. It is very important for us to set project goals and objectives. One of the things you have to do when you're dealing with the Federal Transit Administration is that you have to have project goals and objectives that are achievable, and that makes sense. And so if you look here, we have 6 categories here with varying information below them or other objectives and goals below those 6 categories. Increasing mobility, access, and safety. That is something we really want to do with this project, to give people the opportunity to ride transit and increasing that access and mobility for those who don't have that right now, as well as providing a safe opportunity or safe system. So improving travel times from east-west, that is very important. Improving transit accessibility within the corridor, as I mentioned. Improving connectivity with existing and planned transit investments. That is very important because if you think about it, this area of South DeKalb, there's not a lot of connectivity. And that is something we want to make sure that we're thinking about as we move forward in the selection of a project. Improving safety within the corridor. That is another opportunity that we want to look at when we're talking about building a mode or building transit. Number 2, provide improved transit service within the corridor. Again, we kind of talked about that a little bit in the opportunity and goals on 1. But again, improving that transit service within the corridor is very important, as it's not a lot of transit service in the area now. Support regional and local land use and development goals. We know there's development goals, everything from TOD to other facilities that want to be built. And so that is something we want to make sure we're taking a hard look at as we decide on the different modes and different opportunities from an alignment standpoint. Promote cost-effective transit investments. We have to be cognizant of costs with this because the FTA or the federal government will not allow us to build a project that they don't deem to be cost-effective. And so we've got to promote cost-effective transit investments where we'll move the most people for a reasonable or expected cost that makes sense. Preserving natural and built environment. That is something we will always look at from a standpoint of NEPA, National Environmental Protection Act. So we will look at the impact on the environment and people around. That is something we'll continue to do. And then achieve a high level of community support. We can't move these projects forward without the community support. And so again, your participation in a meeting such as this and our upcoming meetings is very important as we get ready to move this project forward and then adopt these project goals and objectives. Next slide, please. So right here, I'm going to turn things over to Emily Ritzer. She is a part of the project team. She's PM on our consultant side, but she will take over now and go into more detail of the things I talked about going forward. So Emily, you can take it away.
Great. Thank you, Brian, and good evening, everyone. And thank you again for your time tonight. I'm going to walk through the approach that we have taken to date, sort of setting the stage of where we are, and then also getting into the areas of where we'll be moving with our next steps. So we are in this blue box on here, the initial screening phase. But to get into the initial screening, we started with 2 key components, and that was our data analysis, and our review of the existing conditions. As Brian mentioned, in the course of time, things have changed, the conditions have changed, and we want to make sure that we're refreshing the project in order to be reflective of what we're seeing and also what we expect the future conditions to be. We obviously can't predict the future, but we can use tools that are available to us to help us understand what we think those conditions might be. The next step is going through, we developed different screening criteria for how we'll measure these different alternatives, and then developing the range of alternatives that we take through that screening process. Then ultimately running the initial screening and coming up with some outcomes that would move into the next phase. This all really started at the beginning. Our existing conditions and data analysis started with input through our public engagement process. So right now I'm going to turn it over to Katrina, who's going to give you some of the results of that first level of outreach that we did.
Okay, thank you, Emily. And before I begin, I just want to make sure that we say thank you to Commissioner Marita Davis-Johnson for being in attendance this evening. Thank you for your participation in this meeting. And as Emily was stating, our public and stakeholder engagement has been a robust one since the beginning. We've been working over a year to reach out to the community in various ways, as you will see here printed on the screen. Starting in 2022, we did one-on-one interviews with elected officials, our business and economic development organizations, community stakeholders, educational institutions, our community members, partner agencies, et cetera, to understand, the needs of the community. We also did a peer city tour to San Diego we had elected officials and some of our partners on that tour so we can explore the different opportunities of LRT, HRT, BRT. We also have done pop-up events, meeting the community where they are, so that way they are aware and have a voice in this project. So we've been at the South DeKalb Mall, Georgia State, even including the Stonecrest Mall, as well as some other events that have taken place into the first quarter of this year. Arts in the Park, UMBL Preseason Classic, which is a basketball tournament, the Stonecrest Senior Citizen Fair, healthcare fair that was in the city of Stonecrest. And therefore, again, we've been in the community just to try to understand the needs of those who use the service, who need the service, and making sure that their voice is heard in this project. We also had a community survey, which I'll talk about later on in the slides to come, that we were able to understand some of the initial needs, whether it be now or later, from community members, and also stakeholder meetings, again, to rebrief some of our stakeholders on where we are in the project. We've been doing some targeted engagement that included focus groups with transit riders, specifically South DeKalb residents, youth, hearing impaired community that we have coming up. And so again, we've been really boots on the ground with our community approach, distributing community event flyers to neighbors that may or may not be aware of our digital technologies. And so we want to make sure that all community members are part of this process. Additional outreach includes online survey, like I just mentioned, social media and literature drops, as I stated. Next slide, please. And so this is just a snapshot of our community survey respondents. So we had over 1,000 total respondents between November and May, and that was through the help of our community engagement process, as well as our community partners and stakeholders who were able to leverage to send out our information to get it to the masses. 73% of respondents live, work, or attend school in South DeKalb. So we were able to reach a large quantity of individuals who reside or worked in the South DeKalb area. 68% of respondents rode MARTA occasionally, and 21% of respondents ride MARTA with weekly frequency. So these are just snapshots for you guys to review. Again, this presentation will be up on the South DeKalb Transit website, so you can take a deeper dive into it at your leisure. But how often do you ride? How often do you ride MARTA? You can kind of see that here, 68% again, and then relationship to South DeKalb is just that 60%, 60% here that you can see that live in South DeKalb. Next slide, please. So with public feedback, community survey results on service preferences, this slide details some of the information in regards to how many transfers are you willing to make during a single journey. So this takes a deeper dive into the behaviors of our transit riders. And again, you'll see here 54% willing to transfer during a MARTA trip drops to 25% more than one. Here it goes, I prefer transit that 7% can walk. And then I prefer transit that moves people, and 72 prefer transit options that connect riders outside of DeKalb to other parts of Atlanta. And I do want to mention that with this survey, it was online, but we also did have paper surveys that were in English and in Spanish. So therefore, we can also reach people who may not have been able to, log on to the internet or didn't have internet, et cetera. So again, we want to make sure that we reach the masses here. And here, this is about the public feedback in regards to funding and timing. So 65% are willing to pay increased sales tax to support transit expansion in South DeKalb. And then with the timing, we have 48% prefer transit projects that can be built quickly versus the 38% that prefer major transit investments with longer time frame. And so I just want to make sure that, again, you guys are able to just kind of digest the information. I know we're in a virtual space, but this will be available online for you guys to take a deeper dive in. And this is the community feedback that we have received thus far. And I just want to make sure I have Michael Hightower on here. I just want to see, Michael, did I miss anything in regards to our public engagement strategy?
I think you got it all. I was nothing to add. Thanks, Katrina.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, Casey. And so here I will turn it back over. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Katrina, and appreciate that. So as we were talking about with the screening process, we really start with that dive into the information and the data. And as Brian was saying, us building off of the previous studies and the previous work that was done in 2019, one of the things that has changed since then was a 2020 census. So bringing in some updated information, and we look at that and compare that to see what has changed in the community overall. And then we're also looking at how this compares to the entire area of the MARTA system, and as well as key indicators that help us understand the propensity to use transit and where is transit maybe most needed. So, some of the key indicators that we pull from this are looking at where is their population density and where do we have, strong population areas within the corridor. Same with employment. Those are typically areas that will generate riders that would use the system. We're also looking at some of the different equity considerations. Is there a vehicle available in a household, for example? And we can see when we look at this, in part of the area, we have about 24% of people who do not have a vehicle available to them, which compared to the overall MARTA service area, that's typically around 10%. So seeing that we have that need and need for support for transit service is something that we bring into how we look forward and where and how these projects will be delivered. And then you can also see that we have a lot of projected growth. This is a high growth area, and as is the entire metro region. So as we look forward into 2050, we are expecting growth in both employment and in population. So understanding where those components will be in the area that will allow us to provide transit that serves these high growth areas as well. And the next one, please. Another key consideration that we look at are some of the land uses. So how is land being used? What is the type of activity that's happening in different locations? And what is the available infrastructure? So, the mall at Stonecrest is a key commercial area serving the South DeKalb region and expected growth around that. So making sure that we have access to and from that location. What we're also looking at is there potential for transit-oriented development? As we talked about these sort of past studies that have looked at what can happen, we've also looked at transit-oriented development potential that would be a key nodes for growth and intensity of that ridership to really further support the project moving forward. And then we also look at what is out there now. So there are some routes serving the area now, and we want to look at the ridership and how is transit being used. And these are indicators to us of how much usage there might be and how popular systems are in the area in order to attract more riders, and what the coverage of those areas is. Move to the next one, please. Thank you. So the other piece is, what Brian was saying too, is what we're really trying to get down to when we look at these alternatives is what is the route and what is the mode serving that route. So we looked at 3 different modes here and understanding what characteristics play into each of those types of modes. So we started with these 3: bus rapid transit, light rail transit, and heavy rail transit. And you can see the comparison of the different pieces here. With bus rapid transit, this is our most flexible, high capacity transit option, and typically would operate in a separated guideway. So that means within its own lane. It may not be for the entirety of the route. It may run in with mixed traffic, but really looking at a dedicated lane for the majority of that route in order to provide high capacity and high quality service. Another example, mode option that we looked at is light rail transit. And this is a more permanent infrastructure that has typically an overhead power system. So you'll see the wires in like the streetcar in downtown or other systems. We have the example here at the San Diego Trolley. And these also can run in their own dedicated guideway, or it can run in street with mixed traffic as well. And then the last is the heavy rail transit, which is again permanent infrastructure on its own separated guideway, and it is electrified through a 3rd rail that is underneath the system. So those are sort of the main components. When we're looking at the different modes and how we compare them, we're looking at the different stop types and station amenities, and really when we're thinking about these different pieces is how are they accessed, how easy is it for someone to use it and get to it, and then be able to also board the transit system. So with bus rapid transit, we have high quality shelters and wayfinding. The stops would also have real-time travel information to tell you about when the next bus is coming, and then also off-board fare payment. So these are very similar to the rail type technologies as well. And then you can see in the addition to these, just a little bit more investment in the light rail transit in terms of the amenities and the way the payment would happen and what the stations how the stations would actually function. And then in the heavy rail transit, the fixed stations with full access control in and out of those stations. One of the other pieces when we look at this is how often there will be a stop or a station along the corridor and the frequency of those. These different modes serve sort of different types of travel purposes. Typically you have a more frequent service with more frequent stops along major routes where you may have multiple destinations that people get to, up to the heavy rail where you would have your stations farther apart, serving a much longer distance for travel. And then we also look at how many people can be served by these different routes, as well as the density to support those. So typically the higher the density, meaning how many people or jobs are in a given location, residential or employment, that can create ridership for those routes. And then also looking at the cost element of that. We've talked a little bit about funding. We'll talk a little bit more about funding, but the overall capital cost, and capital cost is the upfront dollar amount to actually build the system we're talking about. So you can see the range here from bus rapid transit through to heavy rail transit. On average, bus rapid transit is about 200 million per mile, 20 million per mile. And then you're getting about 150 million a mile for light rail, and then about 350 million a mile for heavy rail. And then in those questions that we talked about with the public is the timing. How soon can something be built? And the time frames, varied project to project, but on average, it takes about 5 to 7 years to deliver bus rapid transit, a little bit longer for light rail transit, and then usually about 10 years or more in order to build heavy rail transit. And the reason for that is in the process for how a project is funded, the level of design that's needed, the level of oversight to deliver that from our federal partners, as well as many other conditions, including the environmental review process. So based on that, when we were really focusing on what does this look like from a route perspective as well as a mode perspective, we developed this universe of different alternatives that we considered, ranging with those different mode types and different route areas. So we focused on a route that would use the I-20 interstate corridor, as well as an option to look at Covington Highway. So, and then those were different options along each of those with different connecting points. So you can see here we had about 10 different alternatives that were configured in order to run through our initial screening. And so with the initial screening, then we went into the process of developing the criteria and then also looking at how we would rate each of those criteria. So if we take a criteria and give it a little bit different weight, we wanted to do that based on the community survey results that we received in order to directly inform that criteria process. So we have sort of these main headings of the criteria that we use that were broken down into some specific quantitative measures. So connectivity, how we connect not only to the existing system, but also proposed future routes. The equity components of that, what are the equity considerations in delivering this service, not only within the entirety of the MARTA service, but also within South DeKalb itself and the region. What the potential ridership would be, was weighted about 20%. And then we brought in the idea of timing and cost into that as well. And also the potential for the need for right-of-way. And the reason we bring in the right-of-way component is because that's something that adds both time and cost to the overall project. So I think we have these reversed, maybe, I don't know. So the overall criteria, just to give you an idea of the breakdown of what went into that. So the connectivity, again, was the transit connections as well as bicycle and pedestrian connections. Then with the equity, looking at the socioeconomic analysis and where we're providing service within underserved communities. The cost, we discussed that a little bit, the time to implement. And then we had two other factors that we brought into this, which was, can you build it and does it meet the design guidelines that MARTA has set forth for the different types of projects they'll deliver? And are there any barriers to being able to build the project? And are there any issues with local financial commitment? We've discussed the funding piece, but at a federal level, often you have to have a local match is what they call it, is some portion of the project needs to be paid for at the local level. So being able to have a known source of funding that's a local financial commitment to the project was an important factor. So if we look at those factors a little bit more, thanks. This is what went into those screening filters, and really this was more of like a yes, no, does it meet it? So the design and construction filter really helped us look at the physical feasibility of building the project, what it would take, how much time it would take, how much right of way might it need, and then is it compatible with those design criteria that have been set forth for the different types of modes and projects. And the second was a local funding filter where we looked at the compatibility of the project against the constrained project list in the DeKalb County Transit Master Plan. So with that, this gives you an overview of the results. So we had our different alternatives with the BRT alternatives and the different routes, and then also the light rail transit and the heavy rail transit. And from this, you can see a sort of summary overview of how the projects fare according to each of those, which is the results of the initial screening, which favorable results on the BRT alternatives, and then the projects becoming more complex and more difficult to implement over time with the other two options. So as a result of that, we narrowed this down to 4 options that would be carried forward into the secondary screening. So these are the BRT options on the different routes with the, either connecting at Kensington Station or the Indian Creek Station, and then the terminal point at the Stonecrest Mall. So with that, I'm going to share a little bit about our next steps and where we go from here. So the next steps is to take those 4 projects through a deeper dive and refinement of the screening, which will include some service planning options. The service planning is really about the frequency of service, how often it will run, how many vehicles, are there express options and more local options, those types of service planning components. We'll also look deeper at the ridership forecasts. And then we'll really be focusing on the stop locations and where they need to be and how many stops we'll have. As a result of that, we'll be able to conduct more detailed cost estimates and consider the construction and operations and maintenance. As we've stated throughout, the continued public and stakeholder participation will be a part of each of these components, and the feedback that we receive tonight will be included in that, with our goal of having an updated LPA by the end of this year. So with that, we just wanted to remind you again of the upcoming meetings that we have. So we have another public meeting in person tomorrow night. And you can find this information on the website at southdekabtransit.com. And then we also have 2 meetings on Thursday, one midday and one again in the evening. So we really hope that you'll continue to share this information and maybe join us in person as well. And with that, we'll address some of the questions and comments that we've received in the question and answer component.
Thanks, Emily. So I have a few questions here that we'll get into that were submitted by way of registration. And the first question we'll start with is, will this meeting discuss whether MARTA will bring rail service to the Stonecrest area? Brian?
Can you ask that one more time?
Sure. Will this meeting discuss whether MARTA will bring rail service to the Stonecrest Mall area?
So as you know, as we just finished this meeting and the others, as you can see, our discussion about rail, as we talked about in the beginning, that is the current LPA. However, you saw the options that we're looking at, the 10 options. So it's really to discuss all of these options and opportunities. It's not to say rail is not included, because it is, as you saw. But going forward, these meetings are to get feedback on the 10 opportunities, or the opportunities we see going forward with regards to the alternatives that we believe are the most viable. Rail is not out of question, but we have to understand that there are some I would say impediments right now that we talked about a little bit, that we're going to have to continue to look at, and we have to look at building a project that is viable right now in the immediate future, that can get people moving today and not 20, 30 years down the road.
Katrina.
Yes.
I mean, I was going to add on to what Brian said.
Yeah.
He's spot on. I think the key point that Brian talked about is that it's a combination of paths. I think, as he mentioned, the LPA is the current preferred alternative. I do think, based on some of the survey results that we saw and that we heard from the community, also, I think some of those slides were available earlier, and this presentation will be available online. It talks about some shorter term goals to provide relief. So I think this is tonight is part of the agenda, is to talk about some of those items, while at the same time recognizing the longer term goal as it relates to the long term time frame that relates to the LPA. So I think it's a combination strategy, but to deal with some of the immediate needs of the soon to be future, the next several years. But it's a combination strategy. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Katrina.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so the next question that we have, how far will the transit be coming, and will it affect the Flat Shoals Parkway, Wesley Chapel Road area. Brian?
Yeah, and so these are things we're still determining. As you know, the current LPA does go through Wesley Chapel, but as you saw in some of the new alternatives, we're not looking to affect as much. But these are still things to be determined. You got to understand, we're still in concept phase. And once we get out of concept phase, we'll have to get into some actual engineering and design to make sure that these things can take place. So I will say that is still to be determined.
Thank you. Next question. Can we discuss the potential economic and ridership effects can we discuss the potential economic and ridership effects of investing in one big project, heavy rail, or a few long distance frequent BRTs versus a lot of smaller projects, local bus and ARTs, especially with TOD and upzoning considered?
So that is a interesting question. When you start talking about one large project, which uses up, and we talk about here, I'm going to use heavy rail as an example. As you saw in as you know, you may not know, the DeKalb Transit Master Plan laid out scenarios. And in those scenarios, the one where the penny, it had to be more than a penny, that was the heavy rail scenario, where you couldn't do anything but build heavy rail. Now, there's a lot of things you got to take into consideration when you're talking about building projects. Do you use all of the county's money in one area of the county, which has to be voted on, remember, or do you spread out the wealth in the county and able to move people in multiple places across the county? Again, we're not saying that heavy rail is not a viable option from a standpoint of moving people. But when you start thinking about moving people across the county as a whole, you got to think about different ways to do that. And right now, ART is a good way to do that. BRT is a good way to do that economically and still move people to the places that they need to go. Remember, we're talking about people who really need the service. So if you put it in one area, you kind of shortchange the rest of the area, the rest of the county. And I don't know if anybody else want to chime in, but.
Okay, thank you. Next question. When will we see the Stonecrest Transit Hub developed? Brian?
Yeah, so the Stonecrest Transit Hub is on a much faster timeline than the transit study. That is something that MARTA has committed to getting online to help in the area. And so to help facilitate, additional bus routes or additional facilitation of transit modes in the South DeKalb area. So that will be something that's moving faster. I don't have the timeline off the top of my head. I have to talk to my counterparts in the planning department who's overseeing that. But that project will definitely be online before the transit line.
Thank you. Next question. What are the options for securing federal funding to significantly expand MARTA?
Yeah, so there's a few things here. As you know, the federal government passed transportation bill not too long ago, where a lot of federal funds are being directed towards transportation projects and to expedite the building of these projects. MARTA pursues all avenues from a federal government or federal funding perspective. I think most of the grants and most of the things that we can pursue, we do. Our grants department, our external affairs department, they are very aggressive going after federal funds that we can procure to build these projects. I can't think of any right now. I don't know, Emily, you know of any? I can't think of anything that we don't go after at this point.
Yeah, no, and I could chime in there too. Is the federal review process typically with the grants that are available? There are some that are very specific and known for transit, and some out of the new legislation in the bipartisan infrastructure law that have become available. But all of those are competitive. That's one of the key components that we have to think about in that process, is it's competitive, and we're competing with projects around the region as well as projects across the country. So MARTA works diligently to look at, those projects that can be put forward at the right time and in the right time frame. And in order to also look at the funding options. And that's why we talked about that local match earlier too. Almost every single one of these projects requires some sort of local commitment. And the larger amount of local funding that can be made available, the more competitive that process becomes. So federal funding is always on the table, but it always has to be paired with some local money as well. And that's where some of the challenges come in order to deliver these. I would also say that once you're in that process and you're in the federal oversight, there's a very prescriptive process that then MARTA has to follow in terms of the design and the process and the delivery mechanisms of how they carry it forward. So those are just some of the things to keep in mind. And when we think about that constructability that we take into that, but federal funding is always on the table.
Katrina, I think it'd be of help, Emily, to take it just a step further, you and Brian. I think this is a great conversation, all those virtues, to kind of talk about some other aspects of the competitiveness on the federal level, like transit supportive land use is one we talked about, Emily and Brian. Also, I think it's also cost per rider. So I do think just as we, just have a conversation tonight about some of those other aspects. And would you mind just kind of sharing a few other aspects like that so that it can be more of a conversation do you mind, Emily?
No, not at all. And I mean, you raise a good point. We sort of quickly went through some of those screening criteria, but those screening criteria were developed based on what the federal criteria are. So when we go through this process, we're using those as guidance of how we really look at the overall process. So that relates back to what we've talked about in terms of the density. There's large density components that relates back to the equity components of the federal criteria, as well as the overall cost. And as you said, it's not necessarily just cost per rider, but what is the overall benefit of the project compared to the cost? And that's a key component in many of the federal pieces. So, how much is being spent for what the expected outcome will be? And that often in turn is how many riders will you have?
Okay, thank you, Emily. I'm going to move on to the next question. HRT is out of the question. HRT is better for longevity and absolutely will increase South DeKalb's economic visibility, but would the HRT extension branch off from Garnett or Indian Creek? Brian?
So HRT, as we kind of mentioned on HRT or heavy rail transit, it is, we've seen it is a solution that moves a lot of people. I will say, we've talked about this before, even during the DeKalb Transit Master Plan, when you talk about economic development, when you look at Indian Creek, that is a HRT station. It's been there for a while, and we're just now, getting the ability to develop it. So it's not necessarily a economic driver that there's a perception of that it is. There's a lot of elements that go into that, not just the HRT being built in one area. And so we try to be mindful of that. I think Michael mentioned this when we start looking at the different aspects of things from an economic equity standpoint and some of the land uses and things of that nature. All those things have to be taken into consideration and have to be in place. And in order for that economic development that you talk about to really come to fruition. As far as the branch line, right now, that is not something we're considering because that, again, the most that we looked at today of the 10 alternatives, those are where we're focusing right now. Anything outside of that right now is even further out. But again, we'll continue to evaluate as we move forward. But those are the most that we're looking at, as well as the alignments that you saw earlier.
Thank you. I think as a starter, BRT would be the preferred starting LPA. And when it gets built and right-of-way land rights are acquired down the line, it may be beneficial to build HRT along the corridor. Do you think BRT makes more sense for the corridor with similar BRT stations like the proposed 400 express lanes BRT ones? Brian?
Yeah, so and that's what we're saying essentially here is that BRT right now, based on all the data and the information and the feedback we've gotten, people want to see something fairly quickly. They want to see something that can move them and move people at an efficient rate, similar to our heavy rail at a high capacity. And so that is what we're essentially saying. BRT right now seems to be coming out on top as being the mode that will do that in this near term, because we've got to get people moving in the near term. Obviously, heavy rail can be in the future because, again, right of way is important. And so if you have a BRT, which our BRTs at MARTA, we consider to be top notch with regards to how they're built. So 75% of that right of way needs to be dedicated. And that's one thing you need when you talk about any future elements of improving or upgrading any type of transit mode. But at the end of the day, we believe BRT right now in the immediate future makes the most sense. It will get us a viable project, which moves a lot of people to get them where they need to go in a shorter amount of time in a more efficient way.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Are you looking at the impact of the Kensington project? Brian?
Yeah, it's with any of our transit projects. We take into consideration the projects that are already on the books, that are already being looked at with regards to how it can affect that project or our project in general. So that is something we do with all projects. When we're going into an area, we try to identify all the projects that could be affected and determine how to minimize that effect or how to allow them to work together.
I'd also like to add that the other terminus that we're looking at is Indian Creek. Indian Creek is also in the beginning stages of developing their transit-oriented development master plan. There's in fact a community workshop for Indian Creek master plan on Wednesday, which I'm happy to share the details of. But one of the great things about looking at both Kensington and Indian Creek for this project is that there is an opportunity for transit-oriented development at both locations. And so one of the things we'll look at when we go to the next round of screening is sort of what that master plan is looking like and how we can best integrate with our TOD team.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you. And Michael, if you could drop that into our chat in regards to the event that you just mentioned for Wednesday. Be helpful. Thank you. And moving on to the next question, can you explain why it takes 20 minutes? I don't know if this is per mile, but it's dash mile excuse me, 20 million slash mile to provide a BRT.
Yeah.
Brian?
Yeah, Emily, you want to answer that one?
Sure. And I would say this is a per average cost, and this is actually based on how BRT is being developed, not just in this area, but also in other parts of the country. So there are a few things that play into that. One is, do you need right of way? That means taking additional space in order to support the station locations. Or also if you need it to add any space for the lanes. Sometimes on these corridors, we'll see that maybe the lane widths aren't as wide as we might want them to be, so we need a little bit more space to have really safe bus operations. The other part that plays into this cost is something that feeds the whole project. So when we look at the stop locations along a specific corridor, depending on where it is, so if we're on a surface street, for example, we're also looking at the connection and connectivity to those stops. So some of that cost will also include bicycle and pedestrian connections if needed, especially sidewalks to and from those locations if they don't exist, and also having safe crossing locations. So it's a cohesive look at the corridor and how the transit would function within the environment that we're proposing it in. And then also we typically have, repaving, especially with a dedicated lane, the paving of that lane. There are some specific types of requirements for what happens at the actual stop location for like parking pads for the buses. And then there's also a technology component that comes into play. And we didn't discuss that in a lot of detail, but when we look at these corridors, one of the key components to helping bus rapid transit reliably function and move through the corridor has to do with how it interfaces with the traffic signals along the corridor if it's on a surface road, and then how it moves through there. So a lot of there are technology pieces that need to be constructed into that. So all of those different pieces sort of fold into the 20 million per mile. So it's not just sort of repaving a roadway, but it is a little bit more detailed. And then in that technology piece is also connecting power and fiber optics often into the station locations so that we can provide the amenities at those stations, such as the real-time travel information, having safety call boxes and lighting and those types of things.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. I am not familiar with MARTA, but are there direct routes to downtown, midtown, or Buckhead from South DeKalb? Brian?
So there are bus routes, currently local bus routes that operate on I-20. So there and there's some others as well. I'm not in, I have to think through the service plan, but so there are some routes that operate, but they're local bus routes, as well as the paratransit as well operates. So you can actually go onto MARTA's website at www.itsmarta.com and get a full picture of the different routes that service South DeKalb and where they actually go, and whether they into downtown or another area of the metro area.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. Who would provide the local match in this case?
Yeah, for a project like this, the local match has to come from pretty much the county. And so typically how that's done is that's done through a levy of a sales tax, and MARTA being the entity who goes about and moves the project forward would use the sales tax money as the local match to the federal government's match to move a project. So the county would have to adopt a plan and actually have a vote on a sales tax increase. That's where the local match will come from.
And I think Katrina, Brian, I think it'd be of help to give a comparative situation, like the MARTA, for example, back in 2016. I think that's a parallel example just for discussion. Brian, would you mind just kind of sharing that? Just it shows an analysis of why they're so important, and also why in next year, 2024, it's been announced that 2 counties will be doing some similar referendums. One is Cobb and the other likely is Gwinnett. So I think maybe help just to put a perspective, Brian. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you mind kind of touching on that?
Yeah, so as Michael mentioned here, if you think about 2017, the More MARTA Atlanta program, so that was a half-cent sales tax increase that the city voted on for a number of projects to be built. And so the existing penny that we're currently using could not build any new projects. So the city decided that they would like to go out and have a sales tax where they can afford to build new projects. And that passed in 2017. And as you can see, we just broke ground on Summer Hill as one of those projects. There are 10 projects now that the city of Atlanta will be getting out of this sales tax increase, plus the other projects down in the future. So Clayton is another example, recently here passing a referendum on joining MARTA, but also having that local match by having a sales tax levied on the county. And so those are things that have to happen in order to build additional transit projects.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Does GDOT's I-20 and I-285 East Interchange project present any significant challenges for the proposed I-20 or I-285 alignment?
Yeah, I'll take it first, then Emily, you might want to chime in as well. Yeah, so the I-20, I-285 East Interchange project does, present some challenges. It is infrastructure being built. GDOT is right away. They have some goals and things that they want to accomplish. And it does impact the project to a certain extent. But that's within the infrastructure projects, 2 major infrastructure projects that are potentially looking to go in the same location. So yeah, it does have some impact, and we have to take that in consideration when we're thinking about these routes and the mode that goes through these areas. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that it does have some impact.
Yeah, and I would say all of that's taken into consideration too as you design it and move it forward. So sometimes there are things that are beneficial, and then there are things that take a little bit more creativity to figure out how to work around. So one of the major components with these interchange projects is long-term, how they work together and how that works with a system if you're actually using the interstate or the express lanes moving forward. So we can look at how those connections happen and what they'll do. What we have to look at then is how do you, if you are using the interstate as the alternative, where are those access points to and from the interstate? And have those changed or been modified because of this type of interchange improvement? And with that, then it's really looking at those service plans. How do you connect? Where do you access? And where are you picking people to and from? So that's what we'll look at when you move forward, especially in the design phase. But as we conceptualize it at this level, we look at it more from is this an actual barrier to delivering the project or not? And we have been coordinating through the life of these projects to see what is moving forward. And these projects are known potential projects moving forward. So I think as much as possible, we coordinate to try not to preclude anything that would preclude us from being able to deliver the projects moving forward. But it is something to be taken into consideration, especially as the project alternative is determined and it moves to the design phase.
Thanks, Emily.
Okay, thank you. The next question. Are there heavy rail projects for counties that currently don't contribute 1 penny that have implementation timeframes that are ahead of the South DeKalb project?
No, there are no heavy rail projects within the Southeast in general. MARTA does not have any heavy rail projects slated on the agenda at this point. Or on the project list at this point. In fact, the only heavy rail projects in the country is one in Baltimore and there's one in LA. And I think both of those are very short routes. They're just 1 station over. So you'll be hard pressed to find heavy rail being built anywhere in the country.
Okay, thank you. Is the BRT routes via I-20 and I-285? Brian?
Is it between I-20 and I-285?
Yeah, they said is the BRT routes via I-20 and I-285. Is there no direct option from Stonecrest to either Georgia State via BRT? And then the second part to that is to go to Kensington. Is it a longer trip? Can there not be both options on the table?
So
We're gonna pull the map back up, Brian. Sorry, real quick.
Yeah, no worries. I was trying to think here. So yeah, if you look at the map here, as Michael Rafferty pointed, we are looking at Kensington and Indian Creek as termini. So those are 2 options of termini station. So Indian Creek is another option outside of Kensington. Now, as far as the I-20, I-285, as you can see, some of the routes do follow the I-285. They follow I-20 and then get onto I-285. And then the other routes are following Covington Highway. So you do have routes that we consider going in both directions, I-20 to I-285 and then Covington. As far as is there no direct option from Stonecrest to either Georgia State via BRT? It wouldn't be a direct option based on the alternatives that we're looking at. As you can see on the screen here, our end of line is Kensington Station or Indian Creek. So getting over to Georgia State, you would just jump on the heavy rail line from the Indian Creek or Kensington Station.
Okay, thank you. And then the next question, has there been any movement to secure funding from the state to work in partnership with MARTA expansion in South DeKalb or any area MARTA serves? How do these projects impact the ATL Region Transit Link Initiative?
Yeah, I'll take the first part of that, and then Brian, maybe you can speak to the ATL. But yes, MARTA, and I will say DeKalb County has the shared goal of bringing in sustained dollars from the state government. And we have a team at the state capitol that has been working for a long time to work with the state government to be able to fund transit projects. In 2020, for the first time in MARTA's history, a bill was passed that allowed for a transit trust fund. And the transit trust fund is funded through ride sharing programs like Uber and Lyft. You may not know, but when you ride Uber and Lyft, you pay a very small sales tax on those rides that goes towards the transit trust fund. And from there, that transit trust fund, which is controlled by GDOT, can go towards transit projects, including MARTA projects. And so there are several projects that receive those transit trust fund dollars. Now, it's a fairly small pot of money. I think for this fiscal year, we've requested about $35 million. But part of the idea behind that is to sort of get the state government thinking about what transit looks in the state, its importance, and how it can be used in the future. And so several of those projects are really focused on sort of what the state's objectives are, you know, transforming some of our stations, retrofitting our current stations, and our public safety program as well. I know one of the projects funded by it is a new facility for our canines. And so this is, you know, this might be a small step, but it is a step in the right direction for state funding for transit. Commissioner Steve Bradshaw adopted a resolution that was adopted by the DeKalb County Commission to find sustained dedicated funding for transit. And MARTA shares that goal and will work to it.
Thank you, Michael. And to answer that second part of that question with regards to the ATL. So the ATL, they are the regional, they've been tasked as the regional authority who receives that federal funding, and we have to have a plan with them. And so these projects do go into the ATL's regional plan once we identify them. So there is a role that the ATL plays with regards to some of the access to the funding that we receive in the region.
Thank you. Next question. We have about 2 more. Are there plans to bring back bus route 216, a nonstop route that ran only mornings and evenings between 5 Points MARTA station to a MARTA lot near the Crystals on Evans Mill Road near Stonecrest Mall? Brian?
Yeah, so that is something I would have to talk to service planning on. You can send me an email, or I'll actually I think I can see who sent that. I may not have your email.
It's anonymous.
Oh, it's anonymous. Okay.
So if you are available, if that anonymous person could email Brian, the information should be.
Yeah, we'll get the answer in that. But I don't currently have it this moment.
Okay. Thank you. And then our last question that we have here is, when would DeKalb need to adopt an additional penny tax in order for any expansion options to move forward? How does that question fit into the planning process?
So, and Michael might have to help me out here, or anybody else for that matter. I don't think there's not a, because of what was passed with HB, I can't think it was HB 940 now. I think that's
930.
930. Yeah, because of HB 930, the county has an opportunity to go out for a referendum. I don't think there's some specific time frames, but I don't think there's a restriction to a certain point, like you have to go out during within a certain window.
No, and I would say too, in terms of when it would happen, this is an iterative process of how the project moves forward. Right now, what comes out of this process will be an unfunded project. And as we said, we're looking for the funding in order to deliver it, whether that be some partial portion of federal dollars, and then needing that local match or some local funding towards it. So I think the idea is to have projects that could be on a list of projects that could be funded through local sales tax initiatives. And if and when that happens, that would help deliver this sooner rather than later. So I think that it's more of a timing of when it would go to referendum, if that's something that the county moves forward with, and then it would help move this project forward faster. Otherwise, the project will continue through the development phase and continuing to look at funding choices throughout. So I think it's one of those pieces that MARTA won't dictate the timing of it, but if and when the funding option becomes available, it'll help advance the project more quickly.
I would just add, Emily and Brian, I think, and I have referenced this earlier as it relates to the referendums. And I think most local governments, as Brian initially touched on, decide when they have, we call them public initiatives or ballot initiatives, as we call them. And I think many times they pair those decisions based upon other activities in that particular jurisdiction, be it a countywide race for a chair or a CEO, or also sometimes they're paired with other activities in a particular community. And also sometimes there's a consideration based upon other matters that may detract from a public referendum, be it other competing issues, be it a educational sales tax or a special purpose localized sales tax, which in DeKalb's case is DeKalb under the leadership of CEO Thurman did a very good job of a supply sales tax, which provided much needed support to repairing, and I think now over 175,000 miles of roadway. So it's paired with activities, paired with timing. And again, it's really up to the local entity. Like I said earlier, Cobb County now has made a decision to go next November, I believe it is. And some may go in a primary time frame. It depends on the jurisdiction. And then once that decision is made, as Emily indicated, it then prompts work to go from a planning stage to an active project stage. Is that right, Emily? I don't want to speak for you, but I think that's kind of what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Thanks. Thanks, Katrina.
No problem. Currently, we don't have any additional questions. William Cobble, we will drop that information in the chat in just a few minutes. I do want to make sure that I just read this last comment here. It is just a comment. The pedestrian access on Covington Highway is very challenging and dangerous. I live within a 7-minute walk to the 115, but I can only take it one way because crossing Covington Highway is so incredibly dangerous. And there are very few crosswalks, stoplights. So just something to think about in coordinating with GDOT and DeKalb. Also, I support BRT for this. So thank you, Margaret, for your comment. And we will drop that information for Indian Creek into the chat in just a few minutes. It is a flyer, and if not, we will definitely email it to all attendees immediately following this meeting. Can upload it. Currently, we don't have.
I want to add one other thing, because I do want to recognize we do have on the call on this virtual meeting the Commissioner Rita Johnson from District 5. We want to thank her for her time this evening. And I don't believe I saw any other elections, but if I did, please raise your hand or let us know. But I do want to thank her for her district is one of the most important areas of DeKalb County and ranges in a variety of ways, serves a lot of citizens. So I do want to thank her for her taking time out for this evening. And if I miss any, I don't think I did, but if I miss any elected officials, please wave your hand or shout or say something so we could do something to acknowledge that. So we thank you, Commissioner, for taking the time out of your schedule to attend this evening.
Thank you. And again, we do have several upcoming meetings that will be taking place again tomorrow and Thursday. Tomorrow is from 6:30 to 7:30 at Browns Mill Recreation Center. And the other one is going to be on Thursday. We have one from 11 to 1, and then additionally from 5 to 7 at New Life Church on Candler Road. And that information can be found at DeKalbTransit.com. And I'm going to go ahead and provide the information for Indian Creek in the chat, so that way everyone can have the information for it.
And then also we'll have the comment form for tonight in the chat as well. And and again, the information's on the screen, the website, and how to reach Brian if you have other comments. And we just really thank everyone for joining us tonight. And we may
have one other announcement. Andy, I believe Andy Schnellenberger is representing Commissioner Long Spears. So Andy, thank you for joining us well tonight.
Yes, thanks everyone.
All right. We will close out with that, and thank you again, and please reach out if you have any questions, and we'll try to get back to you as soon as possible.
And that should conclude our meeting this evening. Please pay attention to the chat though. It is the comment cards, the digital comment card, as well as the information on Indian Creek. So if you have any additional questions, again, please feel free to contact us. The information is on the screen. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.